Beyond China, co-hosted by the Research Institute for Democracy, Society, and Emerging Technology, DSET, and the Business Weekly. My name is Sophia from DSET, and I will be emceeing for this event. We would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers. Please come to the stage and stand on the right side of your book. Patrick McGee, the author of Apple in China. Academician, C.Y. Cyrus Chu, 朱敬一院士. He is a member of Academia Sinica, a former ambassador to the WTO, and co-author of The Ultimate Economic Conflict Between China and Democratic Countries. Next, we have Professor Wu Jieming. He's the author of Rival Partners and a distinguished research fellow at the Institute of Sociology, Academia Sinica. And last but not least, our moderator of today, CEO of DSET, Dr. Jeremy Chang, Zhang Zhicheng. We will now take a group photo of our honorable speakers. Please look at the cameraman in the middle. Thank you. Please return to your seat. Now we will do another group photo with the audience. Let us capture this wonderful moment together. 我们跟观众朋友们都在合照一张。大家3、2、1。Thank you all. It's truly an honor to have each one of you with us today. Your profound perspective on China ensure a thought-provoking discussion ahead. Please once again give a warm welcome to our speakers as they take the stage. The floor is yours, Jeremy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our book talk tonight. So I'm Jeremy Chan, CEO of DSET. We're a national think tank created by our National Science and Technology Council in the year of 2023. So for some of our audiences who are first time participating in our event, and I'm just taking advantage of as a moderator to slightly introduce about the concept of DSET and then slightly introduce about today's event. So DSET, we're a very, very technology-focused, but technology and geopolitics-focused think tank. Whatever we do is, helping the Taiwanese government and helping the policymakers there in like-minded countries for, navigating their own policy solutions for, facing the challenges that we're currently dealing with. Great competition between U.S. and China. The human beings are just entering into the era of AI, and so everything is so chaotic. Every day, all related to geopolitics, all related to emerging technology, all related to the dominance of the critical minerals, critical part of the supply chain. So DSET, in the past 2 years, we have already released a series of reports. Some of you might have already read, but I'm still kind of promoting our research findings for you. So if you're interested in our research, please feel free to access to our website. Currently, we have 4 research programs. There are economic security programs, who are researchers there are focusing on the semiconductor security-related matter. We have a democratic governance research programs. People are researching on AI and cybersecurity, and on national security research program, we are pretty much focusing on the development process of the drone industry, as well as the communication resilience in terms of undersea cables and satellite technology. And the last part, we also have an energy security and climate resilience team. They're pretty focusing on the research of Taiwan contingency-related scenario. On the other hand, they are focusing on this green supply chain to focusing not only the rare earths, critical minerals, but also some of the critical part of the green future of human beings. Those are pretty close to the agenda that whether China is going to dominate the future of this green supply chain. So these are generally our research portfolios. Then in terms of economic security research program, the next page please. These are some of the cases. We very frequently do organize this event. So if you are interested in participating in this kind of a dialogue, please keep in following us closely. But we are very, very honored that today we can have our leading thinkers from not only the US, but also from Taiwan to discuss this matter about Apple's supply chain, about made in China, about what, during the past 2 decades, who and what kind of stakeholders, what kind of elements that make China become the global center for this manufacturing. So again, next page please, the next one, and next one. So I don't have enough time now, so I'm just skipping this kind of our research findings. From our part, we are identify the stakeholders. We are trying to disclosing the stories about what really happened there in the Chinese supply chain, and also by collecting many data, trying to identify who are the key stakeholders for making China as a dominant power for manufacturing. Okay, so then I think I don't want to spend too much time on promoting DSET, but because today we should really focusing on our dialogue, brought by our leading thinkers about this issue. So I'm going to try to separate our dialogue into two parts. The first part really want to address the issue that how China become the dominant power of manufacturing. So in this part, some of the facts, if I want to share with you, China has just achieved its historical trade surplus in total $1.2 trillion in the year of 2025, and we are actually now experiencing kind of the term called second China shock. China is not only dominating the supply chain for low end, they are really kind of dominating the advanced manufacturing supply chain. But this is not a sudden phenomenon. It's it's been a story for the past 2 decades. So I really like to ask our speakers' perspective about, from your perspective, how today's global supply chains come to look the way they do. So firstly, I'm maybe from Patrick. So let me start with, Patrick, so what incentivized you to write this book, Apple in China? And what awareness of issues were you trying to identify? And what kind of policy changes, business decision change, do you hope this book might lead to? And maybe lastly, it's because we are, this is an event held in Taiwan, and what kind of a customized takeaway that you hope we can bring for our audiences here in Taiwan to back home? Yeah.
Is that working? Yes? You want to share that? How's that? That's better, okay. All right, I don't know, that can keep 4 questions in my head, so feel free to ask again if I don't answer. The origins of the book project versus where they ended up, and sort of where the thesis ended up and what the book ended up saying, are really quite distinct. I mean, I didn't have sort of such ambition when I started the book. This will sound like it's wrong, but there really hasn't been a book about Apple in the 21st century that would start with near bankruptcy in 96 or 97, and then taking you to phenomenally successful. You know, that book could have been written in 2008 with the iPhone. It could have been written when they first hit, you know, $1 trillion company, $2 or $3 or $4 trillion company. Well, I guess 4 happened more recently. But it just struck me as strange that if you think I'm wrong right now, the books that are going through your head are all biographies, right? There's biographies of Johnny Ive and Steve Jobs, of course, Tim Cook. But, you know, it just struck me as strange as a journalist that there wasn't a major book that just took you through how Apple did it. So I began to realize that there were 3 books I wanted to read about Apple, and none of them existed. So one was just a standard, how did Apple go from near bankruptcy, you know, the greatest corporate turnaround ever. How does Apple actually make its products? I mean, we all know that they're made in China, but there wasn't a book that really led you through the process of how they sort of oversee the manufacturing, ensure that they have the right quality. How do you define the Apple production cycle? Right, that could be a book on its own. And then the third book, of course, is that the answer to the second question is China. But how did Apple form the relationships with China? I mean, to know anything about China is to realize that you can't just sort of say, I would like this storefront on a corner in Shanghai and voila, we're going to go build it. You need to have the government connections at the local level to do that. So all 3 of those books, I think, could have been books on their own. They didn't exist. And so I started looking into it. Among the major early breakthroughs was actually just discovering a position within Apple called MD, Manufacturing Design. And to not get too wonky here, but everybody would know the tip of this pyramid structure that Apple has. So the tip was called Industrial Design, or ID, and that's what Johnny Ive led for the golden age of Apple. They're the ones who sort of come up with the idea of a product, right? So something like an MP3 player that's going to have, you know, an all-white front and a chrome back, etc. I mean, that's very much ID. And then they would kind of throw it over the fence to PD, product design. You could think of that as this other team of geniuses within Apple that would figure out how do you create one of that. So what circuit board is it going to have? What battery is it going to have? And so forth. And then they would sort of throw it over the fence to MD. And MD was this team of California engineers who would go across Asia in particular, and then with time more and more to China, to figure out who's going to be the suppliers and assemblers. And they would look at dozens, if not hundreds of factories to figure out a bunch of companies that could help them to actually execute it. And then once they had established that and built the first prototypes, they kind of throw it over the fence to operations. And operations was the team that Tim Cook led from 1998 to 2011. And operations' job was basically to take what MD had done and then to really scale it. And so to build resiliency into the supply chain. So if MD had found, you know, 1 supplier of glass, operations' idea would be to find 2 or 3 suppliers of glass so that nobody had leverage against Apple. So, you know, when Apple first starts going to China, it's really not until 2000 and then later in 2003 when they really consolidate. And the early parts of the book are really going through this period where from 1996 to 2003, when Apple for the first time is essentially forced to offshore, forced to outsource because they're so close to bankruptcy that they cannot, they don't have the balance sheet to support their own manufacturing. So they're sort of scouring the globe. I mean, they're manufacturing products in, let's see if I can do this in my mental map here. So Taiwan, of course, South Korea, Singapore, Czech Republic, Wales, Ireland, California, Mexico. And that's for a 6 or 7 year period where they're in those countries before China begins to just win on every product. And every product manager within Apple by 2003 is just realizing that what's possible in China is just on a different scale than anywhere else. The problem is that the quality isn't great. And so Apple's solution to this is to really fly over engineers and to demand the quality be higher and to teach engineering 101. I would talk to engineers who would say we would just descend like swarms on a factory and just take complete control. And so, you know, in a certain sense, the original aspect of the narrative, the contribution that I think the book gives to Apple history is that Apple doesn't go to China because China is offering tech competence that's attractive to Apple. They're going to China to build the tech competence. And so, you know, from a certain perspective now, I think the book's origins were actually sort of modest in scope. I just wanted to tell a story of Apple's supply chain that hadn't been told before. But the conclusions ended up being like kind of bizarrely massive, because what I began to understand is that Apple was having an enormous influence on Taiwan in the late 1990s, and that's when they were creating products that were not, by today's standards, happening at great scale. And once you have the iPod mini and the iPod Nano and then the iPhone, I mean, people forget maybe how quickly the iPhone scaled, but they built 5 million in 2007. By 2015, they were building 230 million. No product with that level of quality had been created before. If you go into histories of Nokia or Motorola, you'll find that, you know, they maybe created that quantity of product, but the phones were like these shitty little plastic things that you glued together. The iPod, the iPhone was nothing like that. And so the quality standards that were needed were just enormous. And so Apple ends up taking control of some 1,600 factories, not just in China, but the majority of them in China. And so the argument became actually that Apple had like a nation-building like effort on China's industrial sector, which is the most important thing for Xi Jinping. And essentially the argument was that, you know, to answer your question, how did China become such an industrial sector? I argue that Apple was the biggest supporter, however inadvertently, of Made in China 2025. I should stop talking, but let me just mention two facts that will, I think, always be associated with the book. One is that this is a public number. The number of people that Apple has trained in the supply chain since 2008 is 30 million. The book will say 28 million. It's gone up 2.5 million since the book was published. So that's just incredible. I compare that to being larger than the labor force of California, larger than the labor force of Canada, obviously larger than the entire population of Taiwan. And when Apple did its own supply chain study in 2015, they realized that they were investing $55 billion a year into China. That was 10 years ago. I don't know what the public figure is now. They probably don't, you know, they certainly don't make that easy. I mean, getting the $55 billion figure was most difficult. But it is probably quite a bit higher. And so if you think of something like the CHIPS Act, which is President Biden's signature legislation on manufacturing, that was $52 billion over 4 years. So that was called a once-in-a-century investment by the Commerce Secretary. Apple's investments in China were 4 times that every year for the past decade at a minimum.
Given we still have 7 minutes, maybe you can further identify about the Taiwanese entrepreneurs' roles in terms of at least making process for making Apple in China, especially Foxconn, because we are very kind of impressive how you know, maybe that's the first time some of our offers from Western context address the Foxconn or Taiwanese business role in making this ecosystem, and they're indispensable and irreplaceable. But you know, it seldom be addressed that they're in Western the part of the world. But how have you like tried to interview with Foxconn or other Taiwanese business, and then how do you see their position in terms of this building process of made in China supply chain?
Yeah, so Foxconn was just like Apple in that there was not going to be an official process of interviewing them. The book is largely told through the eyes and ears of Apple, I guess not the ears, but the eyes of Apple people that were on the ground in China. So I think the book says, you know, that I spoke to more than 200 people. That's actually only counting the people that had Apple experience. I certainly also spoke to people at Foxconn, Pegatron, Jabil, Flex, you know, other contract manufacturers. And that was a really important story to tell. I mean, one thing that I didn't know, and I don't think most people knew, is that the idea of electronics contract manufacturing originated in Arkansas with a company called Spacecraft Incorporated. They began, as the name implies, you know, building components for the space industry when I think NASA 5 was going to the moon. And then they sort of transitioned after that boom sort of waned. But what was interesting about that is, of course, the very reason that America was getting involved in that was Sputnik. In other words, there was sort of a geopolitical origin to how this all began. And the company that picked up on SCI's skill set was IBM for the first PC in 1981. So if you remember, Apple, founded in 1976, I mean, their first computer was actually just a circuit board. You had to bring your own monitor, bring your own keyboard. I would say bring your own mouse, but they didn't even exist yet. That's how early Apple is in the computer industry. But by 1981, when IBM basically wipes the floor with Apple, they are relying on a contract manufacturer. And then you have the sort of PC boom where clone industry really takes off, and they're all relying on the PC industry. So the sort of birth of contract manufacturing really goes back to the IBM PC, and this plays a huge role for Taiwan, because essentially when you're creating a whole industry of commoditized and standardized parts, in a certain sense, this is where like Thomas Friedman gets his idea that the world is flat, right? Anybody can contribute. And Taiwan just ends up making these huge, huge contributions, and this is where you get companies like ASUS and Acer. So let's see, I don't want to go off too much here, but you know, America played this role sort of helping to train the Japanese after World War II to begin building a radar and electronics industry that eventually becomes a big chips industry in the 70s. And when Japan industry, or when Japanese costs get too high and the yen is valued very high, Japanese entrepreneurs go back to their former colonies, Taiwan and South Korea, and they begin training them in the ways of electronics and really bringing up their quality standards. And then they hit the same constraints. So Taiwan is obviously pretty small, even versus Japan. And so when they begin hitting their constraints, you have the companies like Foxconn decide, well, wait a minute, we speak the language of China, the mother of all developing countries, more than 1 billion people there, and they begin building these enormous factories and ecosystems in Shenzhen, right? This sort of capitalist experimentation zone. And then Apple is pretty late with the idea of outsourcing and offshoring, but they just have like a design mentality and a certain imagination of what is possible in China that you just don't see from the likes of Dell or HP. So when Dell goes to China, you know, they're still making their kind of non-aesthetic, kind of ugly computer, but they're just doing so more cheaply. When Apple goes to China, they are recognizing through that pyramid structure that when Ops or MD is working with manufacturers in China, they're recognizing that entire factories can be purpose-built for their purposes, right? And so they're sort of learning what's possible in China and then feeding that back to Johnny Ive's team. And what Johnny is recognizing is that we don't have to do something called DFM, design for manufacturing. That's when at the earliest stages of building a product or designing a product, you think about the constraints in manufacturing, right? You're not going to design something that can't be built. And so most companies are pretty conservative with how they design things. And what Johnny Ive's team understood is that China will allow us to build anything we want, because you can set up a conveyor belt with 1,000 people in a line, each person with 9 to 11 seconds to do their task. And if you're doing that, you're sort of taking Adam Smith's idea, the division of labor, and just like maximizing it to like beyond parity levels of what's efficient and what's possible. So China is just like exploited to a degree by Apple's imagination that no other company had really taken advantage of before. But of course, so much of this is happening because Terry Guo, Foxconn, Pegatron, Wistron, Quanta have the skill sets, but they don't have the scale on their own. So they're the ones who go to China. So sometimes people think of Tim Cook as the architect of Apple's move to China, and he really isn't the architect. If you want to give him a fancy title, you could say he was like the admiral. He was navigating the macroeconomic seas, something like that. But it's not like he wasn't the architect because somebody else was. Nobody was the architect. The way the PCs were being built is they were reliant on a supply chain where the suppliers themselves were in cutthroat competition to make very low margins. And so they are the ones who begin moving from likes of Singapore, Japan, Taiwan over to China. And again, Apple's just able to sort of maximize what's going on there. But they're just sort of the tip of the iceberg, right? The supply chain is just ridiculously important, and it's in a certain sense stunning in retrospect that so many books can get written about Apple or Dell or anyone else, almost paying no attention to how these products actually get built.
Ooh, yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. That was very impressive, especially when we were reading your book. You mentioned about what kind of a role that Taiwanese business has been played, especially Uncle Terry. They actually not only brought this supply chain to China, they integrate the supply chain in China. They only do a lot of the parts, CCP-related politics affairs there with the CCP, governance, the officials there for making sure that the made in China can become possible and scalable. So that was very, very, very impressive from the audiences here in Taiwan to hear about the story and told by you. Then but we are going to have our conversation be more like a dialogue way. So I'm very, very privileged that we can have two of the leading mindset and thinkers here from Taiwan, Professor Chu and Professor Wu. So Professor Chu, because you used to serve as our ambassador in WTO as a trade negotiator for Taiwan, and you've been experience in decades of negotiating this matter in WTO, and you also see there's many of the weird things that happen that China has just been keeping abusing the free trade of the WTO, and on the other hand, you're a leading mindset for doing this kind of academia researches. So in the year of 2022, you published the book originally in English. Right. The book is titled Ultimate Economic Conflict Between China and Democratic Countries. So from your own perspective, how did China's state capitalist system become the center of global manufacturing over the past few decades? And very, very gladly that you can address your own perspective from this book and your own personal experience. Yeah, we can use our slide.
Thank you. Yeah, I prepared some slides. I'll start with Patrick's book. Next page.
Do you want? I can do this.
Oh, here.
Is that good? Back?
Apple in China is a very, very good book. It has a very good description about what's going on in China, about the Apple story. I will treat it as a case. I will describe more institutional factors behind Patrick's book. How does China gain the technology or know-how of Apple? There are some steps to execute their goals. The first is the concept of market for technology, in the sense that China, provide the market, and in exchange for your supporting or providing the technology. How does that happen? It usually happens through joint venture. Almost all foreign direct investment in China were needed to have a local collaborator. And usually, that local partner has to have more than 50% share. So they are the major investor. The foreign company is the minor one. There are only few exceptions, but that's more than 50% is the common case. There is a reference. I treat this as a seminar, and in fact, this is dialogue. You can find that reference in Mary Lovely and Huang in this journal. Because of this joint venture, and China has more than 50% of the share, so taking or getting their technology is natural. In some cases, there are some confidential parts hidden in computer somewhere, patentized that you cannot get, China cannot get. Then people say that you can steal it. I quote FBI former chief comment. He said that there are only two kinds of US companies. The first is their technologies were stolen by China. The second kind is that they don't know that yet. So that's the common situation. If there are some technology stealing was caught, then say the case of DuPont, they brought the case to Chinese court. The judicial system in China is unique. DuPont's China had was called, after DuPont sued China counterpart, the case, China suddenly bring a case of antitrust against DuPont and said privately that if you drop the case, I'll drop mine. So that finally DuPont gets nothing, even its technology was stolen. I would describe the case of Apple in China as a special case. And how does all this happen? My summary is this: China is a Leninist regime. This Leninist regime has so many strange things, including the judicial system. The CCP even said that judicial system being independent it shouldn't happen in China. Everything, including judicial system, serves for the party. So the implication of a Leninist regime is that it's a party leads all scenario. Party first, everything else adapts accordingly. So in the dinner, Patrick asked a question whether letting China join the WTO is a right thing. Well, the reasoning allowing China to WTO is because of the democratization theory. That hypothesis says that economy being good will lead to changes in democratic environment and may destroy the authoritarian regime. That's the assumption. But that assumption fails the fundamental doctrine of Leninism. Leninist doctrine is that politics first, economy later. It's always the economy or economic running or rules adapt themselves to whatever determined on the political side. So democratization will never happen, no matter how economic prosperity in China. Other than this Apple manufacturing case, there are other Leninist regime implications I mentioned in the book. Information flow, okay? In democratic country, we all know the information flow is basically free. But it's not the case in China, we all know that. And among 100 most popular cited websites in the world, I believe, if the number is right, China blocked 89. So there's no information flow. We all know there's a great firewall. So this gives rise to an unfair situation. We all know the case of TikTok. It is a democratic country suing a foreign company called TikTok or Douyin or ByteDance. Why would that happen? Because United States or Taiwan is a free country. We have a free information flow, so TikTok can freely enter. China never has to worry about Facebook entering China and interfering their national security or whatever, because they have firewalls. They decide what can enter and what cannot enter the Chinese market. Second example is antitrust law. Tech company, we all know that Huawei is a tech company. Antitrust law, every democratic country has some kind of antitrust law in different names. We understand that democratic country has a very important idea of checks and balances. We usually refer to checks and balances between legislation, jurisdiction, and execution. But in a broader sense, checks and balances also want to restrict businesses. They don't want them to be too big. So antitrust law, according to Tim Wu, is an idea that want to restrict the size of any business. They don't want to have a big monopoly, too big to fail. But in telecommunication, say in the 5th generation or 6th generation telecommunication, if you want to refer to a Chinese company, which is the telecommunication giant, well, everybody would say the Huawei. That's obvious. But if I want you to point out a US company that is telecommunication giants, you cannot say anything. Qualcomm is only chip design. Intel has chip manufacturing. But for devices, that's Apple. For base station, no big base station in the United States. Not to mention AI applications. But all these are integrated in Huawei. So Huawei has chip design, chip manufacturing, device manufacturing, AI services, base station. They integrate all these companies into one called Huawei, then enter into United States to compete. So there's no other US company can compete with a foreign already integrated company. So if you want to have a fair competition, probably you should integrate Qualcomm with Intel, with Apple, with Sony Ericsson. That's impossible under US antitrust law. So antitrust law as a domestic law works. But if it wants to compete with the Leninist regime, which already integrated all 7 different parts of the industry into one big, giant, consolidated company, it doesn't work. That's the second example. E-commerce. We just mentioned free information flow. So we know that China has great firewall. Any 350 million US citizen can easily access to Alibaba. But none of the 1.4 billion people can easily access Amazon. Let me give you an extreme example. I did some tests. I asked some guys in Paris to log on to Alibaba. I asked some guys in Beijing to log on to Cdiscount, which is the e-commerce platform in France. For each click, accessing from Paris to Alibaba takes about 3.4 seconds. That's okay. Each click from Beijing to Paris takes about 59 seconds. So if it takes 10 clicks to finish a transaction, it would take 6 minutes. Nobody would do that. So that's the unfair e-commerce market access due to the Leninist regime. So I just described to Patrick at dinner that there are 2 types of international organizations, famous ones. One is United Nations. United Nations accommodate various political regimes, authoritarian and democratic. There's little interactions between, say, Russia and the United States or British people. There will be mandatory interference only when there's genocide. No other cases can the United Nations interfere other countries' domestic affairs. But that's not the same in WTO. WTO is a world trade organization. Mandatory trade communications interactions are default. So in WTO, under the same grand rule of trade and the free transaction, countries have to deal with each other, unlike this is not the case in the United Nations. In a sense, United Nations does not have much interaction. That's the reason they can have a unified system to umbrella all different regimes. But if you want to have one unified economic trading system, umbrella all kinds of countries, including Leninist regime and liberal market economy, I would say that's impossible. That's impossible. The previous example just show you why there are so many institutional factors that will naturally create unfair or unreciprocal trade scenarios. So Apple China is a typical example of ignoring the difficulty of market-driven businesses operation in a Leninist regime. Will there be a future conflicts? I think so. There is unavoidable, so we call it an ultimate economic conflicts. My impression is that any manufacturing businesses that standardized, relies on cost cutting to gain competitiveness, no other free democratic country's economy can compete with China because government subsidies. For the Leninist regime, party controls all. So subsidy is natural. Subsidy is natural. But for democratic countries, say Taiwan, any Taiwanese government wants to put some money to a private business, it's 贪污治罪条例. That's impossible. That's very difficult. That's it.
Well, that was amazing. I'm pretty sure we should recommend this book either in English version or Mandarin version. But let me give the floor for Professor Wu from based on your years of experience of conducting field study in China, and you collect all the informations and then in the end publish your book, Rival Partners. And also, the first time I read Apple in China, I saw there's a lot of a quote that Patrick has quoted your book, and I was kind of very surprised. But then I just kind of remember when you were publishing this book, and that was the period after the Sunflower Movement. So many of the young folks like me who are pursuing for more knowledge in terms of the China-Taiwan relations and Chinese economy, or interdependent relations between China and Taiwanese roles for in participating in this globalization and global supply chain. So I feel lots of terms created by you and adopted by us was kind of amazing. So I would like to especially asking the question about so in terms of the term you created, for example, like a Guangdong model. And for example, you mentioned that China is a rent-seeking developmental state. Can you introduce more about your concept based on your knowledge? And also, could you explain how have, based on your perspective, how have Taiwan-China industrial and value chain relations evolved over the past 2 decades in the era of globalization?
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy. Hello, everyone. Tonight, I'm not going to talk about politics. Okay. I think this is a very special occasion for us being together tonight because we have 3 authors of 3 books on China coming together to exchange our perspectives. Apple in China and Dr. Chiu's ultimate economic conflicts between China and the democratic countries, and my own Rival Partners. Rival Partners is an English translation of this Chinese book, 寻租中国, Rent-Seeking in China, literally. That book is talking about Guangdong model. So actually, we share quite a lot in common. And since Patrick is our guest of honor tonight, let me say just a few words about his book, Apple in China, to begin with. My personal impression is that this is a truly superb narrative about Apple, about Foxconn, and about the raised supply chain that we can find in the book markets for now. And I study it carefully out of my scholarly instinct. And I found it myself, it's very useful even for my own research. And I know you cite it in several places of my book, but actually I learned a lot from your book. Thank you so much. This book brings together key developments at a critical moment and offers sharp insights into how Apple and China's institutions really operate. And, it becomes a kind of synergy, So this book walks us through these pivotal episodes, and it shows how they are embedded in a broader institutional dynamics on both sides. I mean, on Apple and on China. All right. So now let me get to the topic that Jeremy wants me to talk about, the Guangdong model. To many people, Guangdong model is already a dinosaur concept. Yeah, but for me, because Guangdong model is like my child. I nurture it for more than 25 years, and the first day I stepped into China, I embarked a fast boat from Hong Kong into Guangdong, Shenzhen, and it's a small town. It's a small town where the Chinese official burned the opiums. Human. What's his name? The official burned the opiums. Lin Zexu, yes. Okay, I embarked on the little harbor, and at that time, China was totally different from today. There's no supercomputer, there's no computer connection among different seaports or customs. So actually, when I get into China, and nobody knows where I'm going to, So it's the situation is completely different from what we see today in China. All right, so let me briefly lay out what I call the Guangdong model, which helps us understand the origin of this is economic development concept. It's called export-oriented industrialization, or EOI model, in the post-Mao era in China. It's very early in the 1980s. Guangdong became the prototype of Guangdong model itself. It was the first large-scale experiment in EOI. That kind of production and experiment happened in Guangdong. That is the prototype. Initially, based on traditional industry, labor-intensive industries. And this model was later extended from the coast area into the inland regions. And this is what we call the stage one of Guangdong model, from the Guangdong itself. Then there came the second stage with industrial upgrading from traditional manufacturing into ICT and electronics manufacturing services. This shift marked a deeper, from Guangdong 1 to Guangdong 2, embodies a higher degree and integration into global value chain. China already sucked into the modern capitalist system quickly, within less than a decade, already become a very important mode of production in China. So a crucial turning point arrived in the late 1990s with the emergence of Foxconn-Apple cooperation, and which is the main part of this Patrick book, Apple in China. This partnership is almost an epitome of Taiwan's role in the migration and expansion of the global value chains, from Taiwan to ASEAN countries and westward to China. Then, I will talk about later developments. So what was so special about Foxconn's role? Because there are so many companies from the Tigers, coming into China, and actually the Taiwanese business community, we call it Taisang. Taisang were first introduced by way of Hong Kong. We were introduced by Hong Kong girls into China. So what's so special about Foxconn? According to my own research and then Patrick's research, Foxconn helped Apple push manufacturing to its limits. It's squeezing time, squeezing cost, squeezing labor, discipline, in order to produce perfect products. And that is the idea of Steve Jobs. You got to produce this for me, and you don't have any alternatives. You just do it, or you don't get the order from us. So China, in turn, supply a massive pool of cheap, disciplined, high-quality migrant workers. They are willing, or they were compelled to work long hours under intense pressure. And this made China an ideal testing ground for Steve Jobs' famously ruthless philosophy of manufacturing perfection. So this is the real origin, what Patrick calls the apple squeeze. So in this sense, Foxconn boasts a representative case of Taishan and, in some ways, an exception, was an indispensable collaborator from the very beginning. And this is why die-in for an iPhone is die-in for an iPhone. 为一只苹果手机而 die-in for an iPhone. It's not just a metaphor. It's a historical reality. It's fact. It records the wave of worker suicides in the late 2020s. From this reason, readers may want to read Apple in China alongside with dying for an iPhone. This book was co-authored by Jenny Chan, Mark Selden, and Peng Ai, and published in 2020. And this book, Patrick himself cites, a lot. So next, I want to say something about, how could this model of development possible? Because there are three forces coming together to create in the first place. Number one is geopolitics on the systemic level and the domestic reform in China itself. So the timing is critical. The US-China détente created a favorable external environment, while China's post-Mao open-door reforms fundamentally reshape domestic institutions. This reform produced a system of what I call differential citizenship. Okay, China has a quite modern system of citizenships, but there's no genuine equality among its different groups of citizens. So we can see the urban residents enjoy much better privilege than their rural counterparts, and the migrant workers belong to the to the hukou, the registration status of the peasants. Okay, so this Chinese reform produced a system. I just explained the differential citizenship and the hierarchical welfare provision. They are provided with different hierarchical welfare treatments, and in turn, a highly segmented labor regime, segmentally built around large-scale migrant labor. So that is number one condition. The second one is global supply chain restructuring. Since the 80s, U.S. brand firms have steadily exited manufacturing and outsourcing the production to suppliers in Asia. In the electronics sector, the outsourcing process, what in Taiwan we call 代工 or OEM, had already begun in the 70s. By the 90s, portable and mobile devices were being assembled in a massive scale across East Asia. So as a result, manufacturing risk, as Patrick book already displayed, the manufacturing risk was pushed downward along the global value chain, away from brand firms and onto suppliers and local workers. That is number two. Number three is Taiwanese firms as intermediaries. 台商作为中间人 as a middleman, as intermediaries. 台商 play a crucial bridging role in global supply chains. They connected U.S. brand firms with China's manufacturing base and translated the requirements of global buyers into the on-the-ground production systems. As Patrick notes, in Apple in China, in the first 5 years after Steve Jobs returned to Apple, Taiwan was Apple's most important partner country. So let me sum up a little bit. The Guangdong model has 3 defining features. First, it is labor intensive. And even now, labor intensive industry still dominates China. And we are not going to be disguised by the very shining performance of the robots or the automation going on in China. That is only part of Chinese manufacturing prowess. But another large portion of that is still labor intensive, and it relies on cheap migrant labor still going there, organized through differential citizenship, as I call it, and the segmented labor market. During the takeoff period, this produced striking employment growth. Second, it generates massive foreign exchange earnings. Without this accumulated capital, China's broader rise, economic rise, military rise, and even the modernization of the military wouldn't have been possible without this very original accumulation of the massive foreign earnings. Third, Chinese workers and engineers learn directly from foreign firms. In the case of Apple, Chinese workers in numbers of millions learn the skills from Apple engineers on the ground. They didn't just acquire manufacturing skills or factory management experience. They also learn how global markets work and how to deal with international clients and meet their standards. So the story of Apple and its suppliers is especially illuminating. Grace Wang Lai-chun, Patrick mentioned her, right? Wang Lai-chun of Luxshare. Wang Lai-chun is a telling example. She began in the late 80s as a line worker at Foxconn. Wang Lai-chun是富士康的线上的一位工人. And later, she founded her own company, her own firm, with her brother, and eventually won orders from Apple. So today, Luxshare is tier 1 supplier for Apple, and Luxshare is chasing Foxconn and Petrocom in China. Okay, I stop here. Then maybe we can talk about other issues later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Wu. That was amazing. And also, I feel kind of a little bit emotional because this is really the first time two great thinkers, the first time meeting in person. No, I still remember a couple of months ago when we were heading to Kaohsiung for interviewing at semiconductor firms, I asked you, Professor Wu, whether you noticed there is a book, bestseller book called Apple in China, published in the US, and cited you many times. And you say, yes, but we actually didn't meet and we didn't contact each other. So this is really the first time you guys having dialogue in person, and we are the witness. So yeah, it's a great privilege. So let's move into the second part of our dialogue. So I want to focusing on more about the beyond made in China, beyond Apple in China, because we just discussed a lot of factors actually who happened in the era of globalization. But now after the escalation of US-China grain competition, I think since the year of 2018-19, and then pandemic and AI boom, well, the geopolitical landscape kind of dramatically shifted. Many of the developed countries started to discuss about either decoupling or de-risking. happened, and then people started to notice about, well, this is a grand concern about the supply chain resilience issue, and this is also, there is many of the new industrial policies being imposed or introduced in Western countries, including the Chips and Science Act you mentioned in your book. European and Japanese has their own version of the industrial policy as well. Everybody is pursuing for a new concept of reindustrialization. But on the other hand, we are keeping witnessing that the supply chain has been slightly reshaped, but not just like that way. There's still an ongoing trend. So we have to sit together for maybe discussing about the future of the supply chain, especially when current administration there in the White House, they have been adopting their own approach for reshifting or reshaping about the supply chain. There is a lot of chaotic things happen in the recent days, not only between Taiwan and the US, but also between the US and most of the like-minded countries. So we have to focusing on this part, for expecting the future, whether our supply chain is going to be reshifted, or whether the supply chain is going to be moved out from China, and if that's going to be partially moved out from China, and what's going to be the next destination for this supply chain, and how about if we cannot achieve that kind of a policy goal, what is going to be in the future of the supply chain. So I'll having maybe I'll have Professor Chu to mention your own perspective firstly, because you mentioned in your book, I'm very impressive about your policy recommendation. So you suggest that the democratic allies should jointly to build another version of WTO, and given we are experiencing the current administration there in Washington D.C., are you still optimistic about the future of the democratic allies, and how do you expect the future of the supply chain if the U.S. doesn't take the leadership?
Okay, I mentioned that different regimes, say democratic regimes versus a Leninist regime, because their institutional factors are so different, they should form different trade unions. For instance, in the world, you often see a free trade agreement. Those free trade agreements are always signed by like-minded countries. You don't see a free trade agreement signed by a very democratic country with a very authoritarian. You don't see that. So trade institutions may be or should be divided into groups so that like-minded countries can trade together. That's one thing. Trade institutions is one thing, but trade coalition is another thing. So we all see that there's many uncertain factors in Washington, so that it causes people to worry. Say, Mike Carney, they started to divest many necessary connections with United States. They shift into Europe and China. So, as I said, again, trade institution is one thing. Ideally, they should be separated into two. But trade coalition can be changed very fast and can be changed back. Let me give you an example. In year 2020, that was the end of the Trump 1.0 regime. The then Secretary of State Pompeo initiated Clean Network Initiative. They tried to persuade European countries not to sign with Huawei, not to use their facilities because they're not safe. At the beginning of 2020, Huawei has already signed 92 contracts. And among them, I remember it correctly, 46 are with European countries. That's a large number. By the end of 2020, just a few months after, the contract number decreased from 92 to 23. So that clean network initiative was so successful. Even the American diplomats were surprised. How could we be so persuasive? Well, the researcher find that it's not the United States was persuasive. It is because the wolf warrior diplomacy was so annoying for European countries. And by the year 2020, there was also COVID-19 because China denied that they should be responsible. So many European countries do not like that. This kind of negative feeling about China helps United States to abolish the original coalition. The same thing may happen now. Yeah. If Washington still creates uncertainty, unpredictability to their allies, it will help the coalition, or recoalition of industrial supply chain in favor of China. Again, this coalition may change very fastly. And if some other day situation change, they may also switch back because business coalition is so easy to change. This is different from abolishing NATO. Political and a military coalition is difficult to change. But business coalition is very easy. Another point I should add toward the end of this slides is that I said whatever sector that has its manufacturing process being mature and relying on cost cutting, and most democratic countries, if not all, cannot compete with China. That also applies to the future. So let's look backward. What kind of sectors China, what kind of mature sectors China has had and then dominate the world? Solar panel, LCD panel, production of aluminum, production of steel. Whenever China has gained its advantage through cost down, it not only outcompete any single country, it outcompete the world. So that still applies in the future. What about future? Electric vehicles. When BYD dominates manufacturing parts, then it will dominate the future EVs unless some other country can provide as large a government subsidy as China did. Low-end chips, it will also dominate unless TSMC has a very successful yield rate, much better than Huawei. Otherwise, cost cutting will be the dominant factor. So I just provide two things. Economic coalition or reorganization of the supply chain can be changed very fastly. Clean network initiative is a very good example. The second thing is that any sector that has a mature manufacturing cost-cutting advantage, then China will dominate all the rest of the world.
Yeah, thanks so much, Professor Chu. We're synergized on this observation. So DSET has been keeping efforting on our part to collecting the information, evidences, and publishing into our reports by keeping alarming our allies that this is a very urgent call for us to jointly secure our dominant part of the supply chain. As Professor Chu mentioned about the legacy chips, we actually published one report last year, the Great Siege. We actually identify that Taiwan is not only leading the advanced manufacturing, but also the legacy chips. We actually still have like 50% of the market share, but it's going to be soon to be replaced by the PRC. So they're surpassing Taiwan in approximately in the year of 2027. So now we've been witnessing that China has been leveraging their own dominant position in terms of the rare earths and critical minerals for targeting the Western parts. But given they're going to keeping rapidly dominating different part of the supply chain, and so they're going to definitely weaponize that part of the supply chain as well. So we don't see very optimistic about the future. So the very urgent call for us to collaborate if that would be possible. But from Professor Wu's perspective, I feel especially especially impressive. Previously, you addressed one of your observation that actually Taiwanese manufacturers are moving closer to the global north countries. I still remember that you published one short piece in the period of the reciprocal tariff announced. But based on your observation, why is that happening now? Why is the Taiwanese started to friendshoring, and why is Taiwanese started to having more and more deeper ties, business ties and trade ties and supply chain ties with the global north countries, traditionally who are not industrialized, but pursuing for reindustrialization? And do you think friendshoring, especially for the U.S. or even European countries, is a viable and sustainable long-term path for Taiwan and our like-minded countries?
Jeremy, before addressing your question, I would like to come back to the Guangdong model today briefly, because these two questions are relevant. We could argue that the model is all gone. Yeah, that the so-called Guangdong model is already history. As I say, it's a dinosaur, concept. And in many ways, that's indeed true. The robots are replacing labor on larger scale and at a very rapid pace. And at the same time, China is producing massive volumes of new export goods. Xi Jinping calls it 新三样, the three new: solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles, 电动车. But I would argue, on the opposite, that some core elements are still there. Earning foreign exchange remains central to China, because China still needs foreign earnings to modernize its military and economy. And so does learning. The Chinese labor is now producing no, I skip it. Yeah. Okay, come back to the learning point. Whether acquiring, whether for Chinese labor to acquire new skills or absorbing the most advanced technologies, they still have to learn from foreign capital. They still have to learn from foreigners. And I think before China can really create disruptive technologies, before that point, China is still lags behind. Yeah. So this, maybe you don't agree that, but this is my point for now. So today, China is exporting recession by flooding global markets with cheap, very cheap products, many of which are still labor intensive. This is one of my evidence. So if we step back and trace the origins and evolution of the Guangdong experience, we might describe the current export boom as Guangdong Model 3.0. Guangdong Model 3. Okay, I just mentioned earlier Guangdong Model 1 in the coast area, then inland, and more advanced EMS as Guangdong Model 2. Now we are arriving at the Guangdong Model 3. This time it's true, it's largely without foreign capital, without FDIs directly intervene in the process. Okay, that is about the model today. So another key question is where all the FDI goes, especially the Taiwanese capital, Taiwanese Taiwanese investments. Today, it's widely accepted that global supply chain move in cross response to, geopolitics. And under growing geopolitical pressure, and this part is well known, Taiwanese capital has been pulling out of China quickly, so quick. What less known is that this exit actually started much earlier. Taishan began leaving China just after the global financial crisis in 2008. That earlier wave was driven less by geopolitics than by rising costs and the changing production conditions inside China. Not only more expensive labor cost and the land price, but also deteriorating political environment in China. In that sense, Taiwanese firms were early movers. Even we may call them, almost pioneers, anticipating a geopolitical shift that would only become obvious nearly a decade later. So if we look at the long view, Taiwanese investment in China, including Hong Kong, has actually come full circle over the past 4 decades. In 1987, 40 years ago, the Taiwanese capital, going to China only accounted for about 1.2 of Taiwan's total outward investment. And it peaked it came to 6% in 1988. But by, it's a full circle, and its peak is takes place around 28 and 2010, and by 2025, almost a year ago, it had fallen back to around 4.7%. Okay, so for now, Taiwanese capital already leaves China. As Taiwanese capital withdraw from China, where did it relocate? It relocated to Vietnam, to India, Mexico, in the global south. But just as strikingly, it also moved to Japan, United States, and Europe now. So now let me focus on the emerging trend of pivot to global north. In this new path, Jeremy just asked, is this new path viable or sustainable? I think the answer is yes, but on one key condition. That is, Taishan's exit from China has crossed a point of no return. Has Taiwan's, Taishan's exit from China already crossed the point of no return? And on this, the trajectory points in that direction. So I'm arguing for this, positive direction. What we are seeing is the TSMC-led development path, centered on semiconductors, AI chips, and servers for data centers. This represents a genuine economic upgrade for Taiwan. And along this, supply chains are expanding and migrating again. In the semiconductor sector, production is moving to places like Arizona, Kumamoto. In electronics manufacturing services or EMS, Taiwanese firms are also setting up operations in Texas and other locations. So one reason this transition is possible is the nature of Taishan themselves, because Taiwanese business people are highly demand responsive and extremely sensitive to customer demands, customer needs. So the 代工模式, the 代工 model or contract manufacturing may look like a low margin business. We call it margin 3%, 4%, or even you have 7, 6, 8%, it's still so tiny. But Taiwanese firms develop a mass production logic, a mass production method to overcome this constraint, low margin constraint. And more recently, TSMC has demonstrated that the foundry model can be highly profitable and even market dominating. It broke through the low margin curse and climbed all the way to the top of the value chain. So all in all, I tend to think that the current path is viable, at least in the near future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Wu, for sharing your perspective on this expecting about the future of Taiwanese supply chain. I think we are all just experiencing about the miracle moment like Taiwan now is like economic performance and its manufacturing activities is booming because of the huge demand from the AI side. And so this is a kind of an historical moment. And just a couple of years ago, nobody was able to predict that it's going to be happen. So I still remember the year of like around pandemic. There is a still huge anxiety being shared among the Taiwanese manufacturers that their position of the supply chain, especially the supplier position in the Apple supply chain, has been more and more squeezed out and replaced by the Chinese players. But all in the sudden that NVIDIA, OpenAI emerged and AI is booming, and then we're now getting the very, very unique position for supplying the hardware for this AI demand. But we don't know whether that's going to be a sustain or how long we can maintain that kind of trend for take advantage of that kind of economic growth. So let us close our conversation with Patrick. So my question for you is that where do you see the future of advanced manufacturing? So I just mentioned about the AI, and now Taiwan is taking a very critical role in terms of AI hardware manufacturing, but we still got a lot of new disruptive innovation now happening or is about to emerging, like humanoid robotics, quantum computing, and something like that. So, but can AI or this kind of humanoid robotics and any other kind of a next generation of industries truly move beyond China? Or they are going to trapped into the same trap that Apple experienced. What is your expectation? And on the other hand, who is going to be the next destination, the most possible destination for undertaking, on the other hand, some kind of comparatively low-end manufacturing activities to replace kind of China's role for these activities? Yeah.
So I wish I could, end on a big high note and give you my big optimistic take. Unfortunately, I really think there isn't a next destination. I think China is going to continue to be the next destination. I mean, to put this in Apple terms, there's a broad sense among lay people that, Apple's already achieved 25% of iPhone production is now in India. Maybe within a few years they can make that half and they'll have a fully bifurcated supply chain. Unfortunately, that's just nonsense. It's counting final assembly only as the step that matters. And unfortunately, for tariff law, that is what matters. So, Americans will be able to buy iPhones next year that all say made in India on the back. And so therefore, they won't have to have any sort of tariff issues to deal with China. But they won't really be made in India in any meaningful sense. a manufacturing design engineer joked to me once that the phones are basically wholly produced in China, assembled there, disassembled, sent to India for reassembly, and then sent on. Now, you might think that with time, more and more stuff will be transferred to India, but there's several reasons basically to be pessimistic about that. So one is that even if you had a magic wand where all of a sudden India could be just as competent as China, and you were Apple, you still wouldn't want to just fully move half your production because Beijing and Chinese consumers would be upset with you immediately. So why would Beijing be upset? Well, clearly they understand the value of having manufacturing in your nation. So the more quickly that Apple moves to have production in India, the more incentive Beijing has to exercise the many choke points it has. So, a former attaché at the Beijing embassy, quoted in the book, tells me that, the day that Apple announces some big India initiative in a press release is the same day that a couple factories lose electricity in China. And there doesn't have to be anything explicitly said. Apple is at the point now where they understand how Chinese politics works, and they would just have to sit around and have a conversation with themselves as to, do we think the electricity outage was natural, or do we think that had something to do with the India press release, right? And they would draw the necessary conclusions, and they would realize, okay, we need to step things up in China and step things back in India. The Chinese consumer part is just as important. There are only 12 businesses on the planet that sell more than $10 billion worth of goods in China. Apple is the king of all of them with more than $70 billion business. I can't remember if it was total revenue or just iPhone in China revenue last quarter that went up 38%. That is not a business they're going to say goodbye to anytime soon. It's just a very lucrative business in China. And so the more that they diversify to India, the more that Chinese citizens would naturally enough see Apple as the poster child of Western decoupling. Frankly, if I was Chinese and I saw Apple that way, I would start buying Huawei too. And then the third point, of course, is there is no magic wand to make India ultra competitive with China right away. Apple tends to have a sort of arrogant attitude when they look back on the last 25 years. They see their success, and they, I think, diminish the contributions of China. And as they try to diversify to India, I think they're getting a real-time lesson in just how unique China was. India just doesn't have the same advantages. So if they try to run the same playbook as to some extent they are, without the same real willpower, I should say. They're just finding that China speed isn't found in Bangalore. And so, India as a government, let's say, whether it's federal or local, just isn't stepping up the way that China did. So they don't have world-class ports. They don't have high-speed rail across the country. They don't have 8-lane highways. There isn't just a bend over backward, learn from the foreigner attitude that China really adopted. So for so many reasons, I'm just pessimistic about India. And the unfortunate thing about being pessimistic about India is it is the only hope of someone really rivaling China, just because it's the only country with more than 1 billion people and that sort of landmass and wages comparable to where China was 20, 25 years ago. So, you can have some hope about maybe Mexico or Southeast Asia, et cetera, but you're not dealing with the same sort of next door manufacturing that China was able to execute, where, you have maybe a Foxconn, but there's a spoke and hub model where beside the Foxconn is plastic injection molding. Up there is metal tootling and stamping. Just so many things that you would need to get done. So I would talk to Apple engineers, and they would say, it's 2 a.m. And all of a sudden you need to go to the X-ray room for something. 100 people would follow you down and get things done for you. You've got the wrong screw for something and you need something, and you need 1,000 of them the next day. That just happens. You just don't get that in other places. And Apple cares a lot about the speed of execution, about the margins that they can get in China, et cetera. So I just don't see them diversifying anytime soon. You will probably see more in India. I want to be clear about that. I just don't think it's happening at the rate that people seem to think, that there's way more hype than substance. I don't think Vietnam is a really viable alternative. I mean, the population is something like 1/14 that of China. So it's a way of saying, like, if you diversify 10% of your production, you hit the constraints kind of immediately. And that's obviously not just about to change. And it's going to be tough to have sort of like 8 nations in coordination, what the Economist has called Alt-Asia, to compete with China. Why would you want your production to be sort of like multifaceted over 8 countries when you can just have it in Shenzhen or Hangzhou, something like that? So I think for so many reasons, China is just going to continue to dominate. And then the maybe other thing I should say is, although you will have more investments in India, the quid pro quo that Apple has sort of directly said to local officials in China is that, sure, we're diversifying to India, but the production that's remaining in China is becoming more Chinese, right? So that's sort of how they're able to win this argument, which is to say, the Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Americans, all the multinationals that have set up shop over the last 3 decades, they're very much being squeezed out in favor of the red supply chain, the homegrown rivals like Luxshare, BYD, Goretech and Wingtech, et cetera, and which is why you alluded to, the Taiwanese sort of seeing their share diminish. Right? So even if you had certain things happening in India, it's completely being offset, and probably even more so within China. A public estimate from UNIDO, which is an arm of the United Nations, is that China had something like 1/3 of global manufacturing in around 2024. By 2030, they'll have 45%. That's pretty astonishing. And you asked about AI. Unfortunately, I'm more optimistic about China's AI policy than America's. Demis Hassabis, the CEO of Google DeepMind, has said things like, we'll have the end of disease in 10 years. Elon Musk has talked about not just, what is the name for the labor that he talks about? Universal basic income is usually what it's called, and he calls it like universal high income or something. He's a term where he basically thinks we're all just going to be doing nothing and be rich because AI will have solved all of our problems. That just seems grossly fantastical to me. Hopefully he's right. I just don't see any reason to believe he is. And, China's model, instead of really focusing just on like the frontier AI models, they're focused so much more on diffusing what's available throughout society and actually embodying the AI into robots, production lines, drones, so many things. And not only is that a better strategy, but even if America were to say, oh, that is a better strategy, let's adopt that. Of course, they don't have the factories, the production lines, and so forth to actually even do it. So it strikes me that the competitive moat that the American model is trying to create is almost non-existent. It's measured in weeks or months, even if you're quoting someone like David Sachs, the AI czar for the White House. So you think of how instrumental or catalyzing and crucial it was when OpenAI came out with ChatGPT, but now they're probably not even number 1. I prefer Anthropic. I think most people think Gemini has overtaken them, etc. All of that to say is that there's mix and match as to who's going to be in the lead there. And of course, the DeepSeek moment from 13 months ago was that the Chinese were catching up as well. Contrast that with China's abilities to deploy AI. They already have a 2-3 decade lead over how much manufacturing can be done there. And so if they begin enhancing those efforts with embodied AI efforts, it's not a matter of American firms just flipping the switch, right? They're building on a base of supply chain mastery that nobody else can match, certainly not America. So with that happy note, what else could I say? I don't know, 30 seconds, so you can ask another question. Maybe I'll try to quickly answer.
Sure, because we still have to leave our times for our audiences for asking questions and having discussing with all 3 our leading thinkers of this issue. Then this maybe just directly getting into the session of a Q&A. So for people who are asking question, please identify yourself and make sure your question as short as possible. And if you have a specific question for any of our speakers, please be identified. Maybe from that side, so I noticed like Guangyin and then Tim. Okay, right, the first round.
Sorry. Hi, so I'm a reporter with Commonwealth Magazine, so I have a question for Patrick. I haven't read the book yet. I just got it. I promise I will read it. And so from what I've heard tonight, I feel that your conclusion of the book is that Foxconn and Apple have helped China build competence in manufacturing, and that's has resulted in over-reliance on China. And so I'm just wondering what you think, or from your conversations with people who have experience at Apple, what should they have done differently? Yeah, so Apple or Foxconn, what should they have done differently, and was that possible in your opinion? Thank you.
So it's a great question, and it's one that I still grapple with, more than a year after submitting the manuscript. There is a certain inevitability to how the narrative kind of plays out in the book. And, I talked to someone that worked with Steve Jobs for 16 years, and he said, look, even if in 2008 we knew that the next leader of China was going to be Xi Jinping, where else would you have us go? Like, world demand for the iPhone was just exploding. It was beyond exponential. There was no place that was capable of creating what we needed. And, he's right about that. So the question is, should Apple have really sacrificed its own growth potential to build a more resilient supply chain? And I don't know. The other thing I think about all the time, and I think most people will probably enjoy doing this thought experiment themselves, is what if Steve Jobs had lived? Right? Maybe not till today, but what if he was just around 18 months later when Xi Jinping comes into office and essentially makes it known to Apple that they are not seen as a company that is in China for China. They see Apple as an exploitative force, and Beijing sort of begins to show Apple in various ways that if it continues the way it is, it might be blacklisted in the country. And Apple takes that very seriously. Google doesn't exist. Facebook doesn't exist. It's a real threat. And so the response on behalf of Apple, to simplify greatly, is to find ways to placate the regime and make sure that China understands we are actually a net beneficiary to indigenous innovation and Made in China 2025. I think there's a good chance that if Steve Jobs was in office, he would have been happy to shut down iPhone production for multiple years if needed to go build it someplace else. One can argue, and we can never find an answer because obviously counter history doesn't work that way. But the other thing is that even though I think Steve Jobs wouldn't have done what Tim Cook would do or had done, I also don't think it's a realistic notion that a non-founder who had inherited the role could have made that decision. Tim Cook was under tremendous pressure to be able to fulfill the vision of Steve Jobs. The share price went down the day that Tim Cook was announced as the leader. Nobody really thought he could do it, and instead he 10x'd the valuation. So the thing that he should have done by building resiliency, by making all the moves that they're pretending to do now, but 12 years ago to actually have done them, I think that's the thing they should have done. But realistically, I don't actually think it was all that possible. Maybe the last thing I should say, and this isn't in the book, and it's a big oversight on my part, it should be in the book. 2013, 2014 is also when Tim Cook introduced share buybacks, something Steve Jobs never wanted. And Apple's share buyback program is more than $100 billion a year. So if you were to actually spend that money building resiliency into the supply chain by making massive investments, Apple could be in a far better position, a far safer position than just rewarding shareholders.
My question is for Professor Wu. My name is Tim Culpin. I'm running an outlet called Culpium now. My question, Professor Wu, is on the back of your scholarship for 40 years. I'm curious to know, with the Guangdong model specifically, Foxconn clearly was a driver of that. And Taiwanese Taisheng have been that bridge between China and the West. Was that inevitable? Could it have been done by any Chinese companies that you can think of? Or was it always needed to have the Taisheng, such as Terry Guo, to be that bridge and therefore allow China to be this manufacturing powerhouse that it is today?
Okay, thank you, Tim, from this question. Short answer. Yes, I think Guangdong or China couldn't have built such a war factory without the bridging role of Taisheng and Foxconn. This all because of the Chinese polity, the Chinese system itself. Just something like Professor Chu said, it is a Leninist regime. Leninist regime means a political idea, but in terms of economy, that kind of economic structure is not market orientation, it is command economy. And Chinese people are on the eve of opening door reform. They didn't know much, because there's a disruption for almost 30, 40 years. They didn't, know much about how to do business in that way, like the Chinese, like Taiwanese, like Taisang. And Taisang is very particular at that moment, at that occasion, because the Taiwanese people spoke the same language and knew very much about the way that Chinese local people, Chinese officials were doing business, So there's a kind of the so-called cultural affinity. I don't disagree on this concept, although myself I didn't buy it without any reservation, but I think linguistic and the institutional cultural affinity still matters at that specific conjuncture. At that moment, if there were not Hong Kong business people, I just said the Taiwanese people went to China by way of Hong Kong, and Hong Kong used to be a very important local operation center for Taiwan. And in the very first step, the Taiwanese Taisang and the Taikan, the Taiwanese cadres, went to China, went to Guangdong, introduced by their Hong Kong counterparts and business friends, But because Hong Kong at that time, Hong Kong's economy already the structure and its depth is not as wide as Taiwanese. So the role, I would say, the role of Hong Kong as an intermediary in bringing the industry into China already exhausted quickly. But Taiwan got a deeper base. So Taiwan's supply chain can keep increasingly, reproduce itself and expand into China. In other words, from Taiwan, we still have kind of a better supply of the engineers and the mechanics moving into China. So I think in the 90s until the early, I would say mid-aughs, Taiwanese capital is, kind of indispensable for this building of a world factory in China. But the story, already evolved to the next stage. I said Guangdong model stage 3. And this story today is quite diverse from the previous phases. Thank you.
I saw a lot of the audience raise their hand, so in order to be fair and manage our time, so I'm just picking each of the row for 2 questions, and please making sure that we are asking questions as short as possible. People here? No? Okay, there. So the gentleman there and the gentleman. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Qinan Xie, representing Department of Labor, Chinese Culture, University, Taipei. My question is that, echoing Professor Chu's and Professor Wu's idea about the labor rights abuse in China, in all the manufacturing facility. But in textile industry, like H&M and Gap, they always hire and supposedly the labor experts and co-work with human rights group, NGOs, to audit in Chinese manufacturers facility or their products. Otherwise, their product will be stopped by the Border Protection Agency, USA, according to the Trade Act of 1974. How come it's something that all the workers work with Foxconn or Apple, other manufacturing facility, they have no right, any basic right to get unionized, collective bargaining. If they go strike, they will be cracked down by the Communist Party. That is obviously true.
Sorry, can you identify your questions?
How come Tim Cook will not see it, and the whole political system in U.S. position ignore the hardcore facts it happened in China? I don't understand. Please.
Asking Professor Chu. For Patrick.
Sorry.
The shortest answer would be the Upton Sinclair quote. It's hard to convince someone of something when their paycheck depends on them not realizing it. Right? It's not in Tim Cook's interest to hold anyone to account. And in fact, when the first major report on Foxconn conditions was from a sort of right-wing rag in the UK, the Daily Mail, I believe it's 2004, it might be 2006, it was about iPods. And Apple's response actually was to build a supplier responsibility unit and to do their own investigative report, which largely verified what had been said. And this sort of has gone on for the last 20 years, where Apple sort of gets called out by certain media players and then they go in to fix things. But it actually caused all sorts of political problems for them, because in a sense, the overall image that you were getting if you were in Beijing was that this Western company was playing the role of white knight, essentially saving Chinese workers from their own regime. And so it actually just kind of looked like, well, if Western companies didn't sort of play that role, an ostensibly socialist country would result in, deaths of despair and so forth at their factories. So Apple sort of had to heel back a little bit, because that wasn't good for their own politics in the country. So it just gets back to how dependent Apple is on China. They have, various ways that they're going to expend their political capital, and one of them is just not going to be holding Chinese companies to account, or getting the government to hold them to account, because of course they need to make iPhones. For what it's worth, there's a chapter on this book about a woman named Jackie Haynes, who very much tried to, she considered Foxconn workers and everyone else her clients, and on behalf of Apple, she really tried to make great change, and unfortunately was not able to.
And the next question is the deputy director from India. First of him and then you. No.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for all the sharing. I'm Peter Jiawei Cui. I'm from International Strategic Forum. I'm the Global Fellow 2025. And my question will be for Patrick, and my question will be focusing on the Chinese government attitude, because in this book, I think one visible impact of behind the scenes is the Chinese government's attitude toward Apple's production and investments in China. And I want to know if you have deeper insights about how Chinese government views these mass production and mass investments from Apple in building up these kind of very large factories in China. And also, I wonder if you engage with some Chinese government officials on how to understand Chinese government's views from very limited information. And also, another thing that I want to ask is that if Chinese manufacturing also creates a burden for Apple, because it actually makes Apple relying on these kind of very labor-concentrated ways to do the manufacturing, and do not think about how to innovate the manufacturing using AI or other technologies.
All right, I'm not sure and I entirely understood the question. I tried to reach out to certain people high up in the Chinese Communist Party, including someone who had lunch with Xi Jinping every week and was instrumental to having Apple have a connection with Xi Jinping. That did not pan out, and it resulted in multiple hacking attempts on my email. So that was interesting. I didn't know when I was writing the book who I should be more concerned about hacking me, Apple or China. And then, the rest of the question. So I don't know. Could you restate it just in a few words?
Yeah, second question of mine is that a Chinese manufacturing model also creates the burden for Apple for them to stay on this kind of very labor-concentrated ways to do the manufacturing on iPhones, and instead of thinking how to innovate or using AI or some other technologies to renovate or innovate its manufacturing process.
So you're wondering if they don't have to be so labor-intensive in the future because of breakthrough technologies and so forth?
Yes, and also you can see that there's the kind of like forces coming from the democratic countries. If you move these models to other more democratic countries, then you need to face the pressure from the laborers.
So if there's a breakthrough, maybe you don't have to have such a labor-intensive model, and if you don't need a labor-intensive model, then why not do it closer to the customer or something like that, right? So unfortunately, even if you had a magic machine where all you had to do was put the inputs in and then iPhones came out the other end, China is frankly, in a better position to utilize that machine than anyone else, right? Because it's not just that China has the labor intensity and the ecosystems and so forth. They're doing all the mining and refining of all the necessary things that you would put into that machine. So yeah, so often, especially in America, you have this idea that, well, don't worry, we're going to come up with a new way to manufacture stuff. It won't be so labor dependent, and therefore we're going to win. And there just doesn't seem to be much of a recognition that even in that fanciful model, that would leverage China's existing capabilities.
Deputy Director, please.
This is Mukesh Kaushik from India, a journalist from India. Patrick, you were sounding so pessimistic about India's prospects that I was almost losing courage to ask this question. But my only courage came from Professor Chu, who said that that Apple or iPhone made under any democratic regime may be much more brighter than under Leninist regime. Having said that, since we Indians are not hoping to replace China or in near future become an alternative to China, so what future you see for India so far as Apple is concerned? And secondly, do you see any collaboration between Taiwan and India, economic coalition, so that they can do something sort of China is doing?
So I would love, first of all, to see and hear and read all about massive Taiwanese investments going into India, right? There would be nothing more than I would like than to be proven wrong about India's chances as a manufacturing giant. I speak to Indian ministers. The book has gone down very well in India, and there's a chapter on India called Plan B, Assembly in India ? But I have more to say about it, and I think I'll be in India at the end of the month. So, in a certain sense, India doesn't want to take the do-it-all approach that China has. India wants the higher value added tasks, right? They want to compete with, in a certain sense, Samsung more than they want to compete with Foxconn. And I think, when I talk to Apple engineers on the ground in Karnataka, in Tamil Nadu, what they will tell me is that the Indian engineers resent being taught by the Apple engineers. They think they already know how to build something. And the Apple engineers are trying to say, yeah, you know how to build something, but you don't know how to build it at Apple quality standards. And so they've been building iPhones since 2017 there, but not in great scale. And even when Indian media sometimes tries to hype up how much scale there's been, it just doesn't compute with how much scale there is in China, not necessarily today, but even going back. So remember, in 2007, there were 5 million iPhones that were built. By 2015, it was 230 million. If you run the sort of same numbers for 2017 to 2024, it went from about 0 to around 25 million. So basically, the India hype story is operating at 1/10 the scale of what China did 10 years prior. And even though that already has sort of made my point for me, in China, it was everything that was taking place, right? In India, it was basically just the final assembly. So Apple's efforts since 2017 in India have been pretty modest. I would love to see more in India. I would love to see the Taiwanese teaching more in India. I would love to see more Apple investments there. But I think for a host of reasons, it's not going to pan out. I would love to be wrong.
Well, we should include. accept more questions, but we are already running out of the time. So thank you so much for participating in this event. Our speakers is going to stay here for a while, so yeah, maybe we can have a further conversation with all of our speakers. But firstly, let us give a big round of applause for our three speakers. And also, so our co-organizer, Business Weekly, is here. The editor-in-chief, Ms. Lin Yun, is jointly to organize this event with us. And so please find if you want to purchase the book, and then there's a session outside. So feel free to interact and exchange opinions with our speakers. Thank you so much for participating.
Sorry, can I just say it is such an honor to be here, especially to have such two esteemed scholars who've spent their lives working on this, and even just to have the book published in Taiwan is just an enormous honor for me, unimaginable a year ago. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's Experts Dialogue. DSET and Business Weekly would like to sincerely thank all of our speakers and participants for your valuable discussion and participation. We hope that the insight from today's event give you much to ponder on. And Patrick will be hosting book signing just outside of the room shortly. We welcome you to head out and meet him there. Thank you.